Chapter 5 The Parlor Orator. We had been lounging one evening down Oxford Street, Holborn, Cheapside, Coleman Street, Finsbury Square, and so on, with the intention of returning westward by Pittenville and the New Road, when we began to feel rather thirsty and disposed to rest for 5 or 10 minutes. So we turned back towards an old, quiet, decent public house, which we remembered to have passed but a moment before. It was not far from the city road, for the purpose of solacing ourselves with a glass of ale. The house was none of your stuccoed, French-polished, illuminated palaces, but a modest public house of the old school, with a little old bar, and a little old landlord who, with a wife and daughter of the same pattern, was comfortably seated in the bar aforesaid, a snug little room with a cheerful fire, protected by a large screen, from behind which the young lady emerged on our representing our inclination for a glass of ale. "Won't you walk into the parlour, sir?" said the young lady in seductive tones. "You had better walk into the parlour, sir," said the little old landlord, throwing his chair back and looking round one side of the screen to survey our appearance. "You had much better step into the parlour, sir," said the little old lady, popping out her head on the other side of the screen. We cast a slight glance around, as if to express our ignorance of the locality so much recommended. The little old landlord observed it, bustled out of the small door of the small bar, and forthwith ushered us into the parlour itself. It was an ancient, dark-looking room, with oaken wainscoting, a sanded floor, and a high mantelpiece. The walls were ornamented with 3 or 4 old colored prints in black frames, each print representing a naval engagement, with a couple of men of war banging away at each other most vigorously, while another vessel or two were blowing up in the distance, and the foreground presented a miscellaneous collection of broken masts and blue legs sticking up out of the water. Depending from the ceiling in the center of the room were a gaslight and bell pull. On each side were 3 or 4 long, narrow tables, behind which was a thickly planted row of those slippery, shiny-looking wooden chairs, peculiar to hostelries of this description. The monotonous appearance of the sanded boards was relieved by an occasional spittoon, and a triangular pile of those useful articles adorned the 2 upper corners of the apartment. At the furthest table, nearest the fire, with his face towards the door at the bottom of the room, sat a stoutish man of about 40, whose short, stiff, black hair curled closely round a broad, high forehead, and a face to which something besides water and exercise had communicated a rather inflamed appearance. He was smoking a cigar, with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and had that confident oracular air which marked him as the leading politician, general authority, and universal anecdote relater of the place. He had evidently just delivered himself of something very weighty, for the remainder of the company were puffing at their respective pipes and cigars in a kind of solemn abstraction, as if quite overwhelmed with the magnitude of the subject recently under discussion. On his right hand sat an elderly gentleman with a white head and a broad-brimmed brown hat. On his left, a sharp-nosed, light-haired man in a brown surtout reaching nearly to his heels, who took a whiff at his pipe and an admiring glance at the red-faced man alternately. "Very extraordinary," said the light-haired man after a pause of 5 minutes. A murmur of assent ran through the company. "Not at all extraordinary, not at all," said the red-faced man, awakening suddenly from his reverie, and turning upon the light-haired man the moment he had spoken. "Why should it be extraordinary? Why is it extraordinary? Prove it to be extraordinary." "Oh, if you come to that," said the light-haired man meekly. "Come to that!" ejaculated the man with the red face. "But we must come to that. We stand, in these times, upon a calm elevation of intellectual attainment, and not in the dark recess of mental deprivation. Proof is what I require. Proof, and not assertions, in these stirring times. Every gentleman that knows me knows what was the nature and effect of my observations, when it was in the contemplation of the Old Street Suburban Representative Discovery Society, to recommend a candidate for that place in Cornwall there. I forget the name of it." "Mr. Snowby," said Mr. Wilson, is a fit and proper person to represent the borough in Parliament. Prove it, says I. He is a friend to reform, says Mr. Wilson. Prove it, says I. The abolitionist of the national debt, the unflinching opponent of pensions, the uncompromising advocate of the Negro, the reducer of sinecures and the duration of parliaments, the extender of nothing but the suffrages of the people, says Mr. Wilson. Prove it, says I. His acts prove it, says he. Prove them, says I. And he could not prove them, said the red-faced man, looking round triumphantly. And the borough didn't have him. And if you carried this principle to the full extent, you'd have no debt, no pensions, no sinecures, no Negroes, no nothing. And then, standing upon an elevation of intellectual attainment, and having reached the summit of popular prosperity, you might bid defiance to the nations of the earth, and direct yourselves in the proud confidence of wisdom and superiority. This is my argument. This always has been my argument. And if I was a member of the House of Commons tomorrow, I'd make 'em shake in their shoes with it. And the red-faced man, having struck the table very hard with his clenched fist, to add weight to the declaration, smoked away like a brewery. Well, said the sharp-nosed man in a very slow and soft voice, addressing the company in general, I always do say that of all the gentlemen I have the pleasure of meeting in this room, there is not one whose conversation I like to hear so much as Mr. Rogers's, who is such improving company. Improving company, said Mr. Rogers, for that, it seemed, was the name of the red-faced man. You may say I am improving company, for I've improved you all to some purpose. Though as to my conversation being as my friend Mr. Ellis here describes it, that is not for me to say anything about. You, gentlemen, are the best judges on that point. But this I will say. When I came into this parish and first used this room 10 years ago, I don't believe there was one man in it who knew he was a slave. And now you all know it, and writhe under it. Inscribe that upon my tomb, and I am satisfied. Why, as to inscribing it on your tomb, said a little greengrocer with a chubby face, of course you can have anything chalked up, as you likes to pay for, so far as it relates to yourself and your affairs. But when you come to talk about slaves, and that their abuse, you'd better keep it in on the family, 'cause I, for one, don't like to be called them names, night after night. You are a slave, said the red-faced man, and the most pitiable of all slaves. Really odd if I am, interrupted the greengrocer, for I got no good out of the 20 million that was paid for emancipation, anyhow. A willing slave, ejaculated the red-faced man, getting more red with eloquence and contradiction, resigning the dearest birthright of your children, neglecting the sacred call of liberty, who, standing imploringly before you, appeals to the warmest feelings of your heart, and points to your helpless infants, but in vain. Prove it, said the greengrocer. Prove it, sneered the man with the red face. What? Bending beneath the yoke of an insolent and factious oligarchy, bowed down by the domination of cruel laws, groaning beneath tyranny and oppression on every hand, at every side, and in every corner. Prove it! The red-faced man abruptly broke off, sneered melodramatically, and buried his countenance and his indignation together in a quart pot. To be sure, Mr. Rogers, said a stout broker in a large waistcoat, who had kept his eyes fixed on this luminary all the time he was speaking. To be sure, said the broker with a sigh. That's the point. Of course, said divers members of the company, who understood almost as much about the matter as the broker himself. You had better let him alone, Tommy, said the broker, by way of advice to the little greengrocer. He can tell what's o'clock by an 8-day, without looking at the minute hand, he can. Try it on some other suit. It won't do with him, Tommy. What is a man? Continued the red-faced specimen of the species, jerking his hat indignantly from its peg on the wall. What is an Englishman? Is he to be trampled upon by every oppressor? Is he to be knocked down at everybody's bidding? What's freedom? Not a standing army. What's a standing army? Not freedom. What's general happiness? Not universal misery. Liberty ain't the window tax, is it? The lords ain't the commons, are they? And the red-faced man, gradually bursting into a radiating sentence, in which such adjectives as dastardly, oppressive, violent, and sanguinary formed the most conspicuous words, knocked his hat indignantly over his eyes, left the room, and slammed the door after him. "Wonderful man," said he of the sharp nose. "Splendid speaker," added the broker. "Great power," said everybody but the greengrocer. And as they said it, the whole party shook their heads mysteriously, and one by one retired, leaving us alone in the old parlor. If we had followed the established precedent in all such instances, we should have fallen into a fit of musing without delay. The ancient appearance of the room, the old paneling of the wall, the chimney blackened with smoke and age, would have carried us back 100 years at least, and we should have gone dreaming on until the pewter pot on the table, or the little beer chiller on the fire, had started into life, and addressed to us a long story of days gone by. But, by some means or other, we were not in a romantic humor, and although we tried very hard to invest the furniture with vitality, it remained perfectly unmoved, obstinate, and sullen. Being thus reduced to the unpleasant necessity of musing about ordinary matters, our thoughts reverted to the red-faced man and his oratorical display. A numerous race are these red-faced men. There is not a parlor, or a club-room, or a benefit society, or a humble party of any kind without its red-faced man. Weak-pated dolts they are, and a great deal of mischief they do to their cause, however good. So, just to hold a pattern one up, to know the others by, we took his likeness at once and put him in here. And that is the reason why we have written this paper. Chapter 6. The Hospital Patient. In our rambles through the streets of London after evening has set in, we often pause beneath the windows of some public hospital, and picture to ourselves the gloomy and mournful scenes that are passing within. The sudden moving of a taper as its feeble ray shoots from window to window, until its light gradually disappears, as if it were carried farther back into the room to the bedside of some suffering patient, is enough to awaken a whole crowd of reflections. The mere glimmering of the low-burning lamps, which, when all other habitations are wrapped in darkness and slumber, denote the chamber where so many forms are writhing with pain, or wasting with disease, is sufficient to check the most boisterous merriment. Who can tell the anguish of those weary hours, when the only sound the sick man hears is the disjointed wanderings of some feverish slumberer near him, the low moan of pain, or perhaps the muttered, long-forgotten prayer of a dying man? Who, but they who have felt it, can imagine the sense of loneliness and desolation, which must be the portion of those who in the hour of dangerous illness are left to be tended by strangers? For what hands, be they ever so gentle, can wipe the clammy brow, or smooth the restless bed, like those of mother, wife, or child? Impressed with these thoughts, we have turned away through the nearly deserted streets, and the sight of the few miserable creatures still hovering about them has not tended to lessen the pain which such meditations awaken. The hospital is a refuge and resting place for hundreds, who but for the institutions must die in the streets and doorways. But what can be the feelings of some outcasts when they are stretched on the bed of sickness with scarcely a hope of recovery? The wretched woman who lingers about the pavement, hours after midnight, in the miserable shadow of a man, the ghastly remnant that want and drunkenness have left, which crouches beneath a window ledge, to sleep where there is some shelter from the rain, have little to bind them to life. But what have they to look back upon in death? What are the unwonted comforts of a roof and a bed to them, when the recollections of a whole life of debasement stalk before them, when repentance seems a mockery, and sorrow comes too late? About a 12-month ago, as we were strolling through Covent Garden, we had been thinking about these things overnight, we were attracted by the very prepossessing appearance of a pickpocket, who, having declined to take the trouble of walking to the police office, on the ground that he hadn't the slightest wish to go there at all, was being conveyed thither in a wheelbarrow to the huge delight of a crowd. Somehow, we can never resist joining a crowd, so we turned back with the mob and entered the office, in company with our friend the pickpocket, a couple of policemen, and as many dirty-faced spectators as could squeeze their way in. There was a powerful, ill-looking young fellow at the bar, who was undergoing an examination on the very common charge of having, on the previous night, ill-treated a woman with whom he lived in some court hard by. Several witnesses bore testimony to acts of the grossest brutality, and a certificate was read from the house surgeon of a neighboring hospital, describing the nature of the injuries the woman had received, and intimating that her recovery was extremely doubtful. Some question appeared to have been raised about the identity of the prisoner, for when it was agreed that the two magistrates should visit the hospital at 8 o'clock that evening to take her deposition, it was settled that the man should be taken there also. He turned pale at this, and we saw him clench the bar very hard when the order was given. He was removed directly afterwards, and he spoke not a word. We felt an irrepressible curiosity to witness this interview, although it is hard to tell why at this instant, for we knew it must be a painful one. It was no very difficult matter for us to gain permission, and we obtained it. The prisoner and the officer who had him in custody were already at the hospital when we reached it, and waiting the arrival of the magistrates in a small room below stairs. The man was handcuffed, and his hat was pulled forward over his eyes. It was easy to see, though, by the whiteness of his countenance and the constant twitching of the muscles of his face, that he dreaded what was to come. After a short interval, the magistrates and clerk were bowed in by the house surgeon and a couple of young men who smelt very strong of tobacco smoke. They were introduced as dressers, and after one magistrate had complained bitterly of the cold, and the other of the absence of any news in the evening paper, it was announced that the patient was prepared, and we were conducted to the casualty ward in which she was lying. The dim light which burnt in the spacious room increased rather than diminished the ghastly appearance of the hapless creatures in the beds, which were ranged in 2 long rows on either side. In one bed lay a child enveloped in bandages, with its body half consumed by fire. In another, a female rendered hideous by some dreadful accident was wildly beating her clenched fists on the coverlet in pain. On a third, there lay stretched a young girl, apparently in the heavy stupor often the immediate precursor of death. Her face was stained with blood, and her breast and arms were bound up in folds of linen. 2 or 3 of the beds were empty, and their recent occupants were sitting beside them, but with faces so wan and eyes so bright and glassy that it was fearful to meet their gaze. On every face was stamped the expression of anguish and suffering. The object of the visit was lying at the upper end of the room. She was a fine young woman of about 2 or 3 and 20. Her long black hair, which had been hastily cut from near the wounds on her head, streamed over the pillow in jagged and matted locks. Her face bore deep marks of the ill usage she had received. Her hand was pressed upon her side, as if her chief pain were there. Her breathing was short and heavy, and it was plain to see that she was dying fast. She murmured a few words in reply to the magistrate's inquiry whether she was in great pain, and, having been raised on the pillow by the nurse, looked vacantly upon the strange countenances that surrounded her bed. The magistrate nodded to the officer to bring the man forward. He did so, and stationed him at the bedside. The girl looked on with a wild and troubled expression of face, but her sight was dim, and she did not know him. "Take off his hat," said the magistrate. The officer did as he was desired, and the man's features were disclosed. The girl started up, with an energy quite preternatural. The fire gleamed in her heavy eyes, and the blood rushed to her pale and sunken cheeks. It was a convulsive effort. She fell back upon her pillow, and covering her scarred and bruised face with her hands, burst into tears. The man cast an anxious look towards her, but otherwise appeared wholly unmoved. After a brief pause, the nature of the errand was explained, and the oath tendered. "Oh no, gentlemen," said the girl, raising herself once more and folding her hands together. "No, gentlemen, for God's sake, I did it myself. It was nobody's fault. It was an accident. He didn't hurt me. He wouldn't hurt me for all the world. Jack, Dear Jack, you know you wouldn't." Her sight was fast failing her, and her hand groped over the bedclothes in search of his. Brute as the man was, he was not prepared for this. He turned his face from the bed and sobbed. The girl's color changed, and her breathing grew more difficult. She was evidently dying. "We respect the feelings which prompt you to this." "We respect the feelings which prompt you to this," said the gentleman who had spoken first. "But let me warn you not to persist in what you know to be untrue until it is too late. It cannot save him." "Jack," murmured the girl, laying her hand upon his arm, "they shall not persuade me to swear your life away. He didn't do it, gentlemen. He never hurt me." She grasped his arm tightly and added in a broken whisper, "I hope God Almighty will forgive me all the wrong I have done and the life I have led. God bless you, Jack. Some kind gentleman take my love to my poor old father. 5 years ago he said he wished I had died a child. Oh, I wish I had! I wish I had!" The nurse bent over the girl for a few seconds, and then drew the sheet over her face. It covered a corpse.